So tonight, our first keynote of this symposium is titled Thinking Ahead by Trudi Sandmeier. When I started the HPP program at Cornell in 2010, Trudi was already teaching at University of Southern California. She was also part of the Los Angeles Conservancy as the director of education, I believe. Los Angeles Conservancy, as you may know, is the largest local historic preservation nonprofit in the US. And when I was at Cornell, I seek to do my internship with them. I ended up doing my internship with the Historic Ethica, but from that time, Trudi became a role model for me. Trudi Sandmeier is the director of graduate program in heritage conservation and an associate professor of practice in architecture at the University of Southern California. She holds a Bachelor of Arts in History from the University of California, Los Angeles, and an MA in Historic Preservation Planning from Cornell University. She co-founded and currently serves as president of the nonprofit Will Rogers Ranch Foundation, an organization dedicated to the ongoing restoration, rehabilitation, and preservation of Will Rogers State Historic Park. In addition, she serves as a board member of the Docomomo Southern California chapter, the California Preservation Foundation, and the Historic Preservation Education Foundation. Her work centers on the conservation of the recent past and efforts to make visible the impact of underrepresented communities on the historic built environment. I'm so excited she has decided to join the symposium this year. Please join me in welcoming Trudi Sandmeier.
Thank you. It's always very strange. I have crazy imposter syndrome when it comes to all of this. So that's a very kind introduction and lovely things that you said. That's nice. Okay, well, I'm gonna share my screen here. Okay. So let me just close a few things so it stops making noise. All right, so you can see my screen, everyone? Yes? Okay, great, thank you.
Yes.
Terrific, thank you. So I was really honored to be asked to participate in this year. This is really amazing. And it made me laugh a little bit when you said I was HPP 2000, because it made me think, ooh, I'm like a robot. HPP 2000. You know, I feel like with all the years that people have been mentioning that they were graduating, I feel a little bit like the OG here. And that's a good thing in our world. So I'm going to embrace that and kind of go from there. So a couple of updates from the introduction. Things have changed in the last 2 weeks. One,
I just noticed. Congratulations.
Yeah, so I am now a full professor of practice, which is exciting. And but I'm no longer the director of the Heritage Conservation Program at USC.
Nice.
A whole crazy series of events have occurred, and I am not going to be doing that anymore. So in any case, breaking news. So I've been thinking a lot about what to say tonight and what I mean by thinking ahead. And I've spent a lot of time consulting my crystal ball. That is not actually me in that photo, but this is what I envisioned myself doing, trying to think about how to talk about this and what to say tonight, thinking ahead about our field and about sort of preservation generation and what does that mean? So the alternate title to my talk could be things that keep me up at night. These are the things that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Am I preparing my students for the challenges of the next generation of opportunities and changes and things that are coming down the pike. Am I doing what needs to be done? And so I think a lot about what's next and where we need to be. I think in conservation education, we are always trying to stay one step ahead, so that you guys are ready to take on what's next. So it's a lot of that crystal ball gazing that I was talking about earlier. So here's, kind of one of the things that we work with, right? Here's the NICP standards. Here's all the programs that NICP certifies meet these basic standards. We all have these pieces as part of our programs. And these are the basic building blocks that we use. And I'm wondering, I'm thinking a lot about that these days. Are we missing things? Are there things that should be added to this list that all NICP programs should be thinking about beyond what has been traditionally required? And I'm sure Michael is raising his eyebrow. I can't see him, but I'm sure it's happening. So we still need to do these things, right? We still need to go out and do the investigation of historic sites and creep around in all of the guano that exists in the world and, wear our personal protective equipment and do all of those things. We also need to examine the documentation and complete the documentation. Those are still essential building blocks for what we do. And crucial to our work, and that's never going to change. Those are always going to be elements of what we do. I think another thing that we are always going to be thinking about is, this is how the world sees us, and this is how we see ourselves, right? So we're a small fish in a big pond, and we are always looking to be a much bigger fish, to have a broader impact and to influence things beyond our little tiny pond. And so, we're always sort of seeking this status. So a few years ago in 2016, there was a moment, right? There was a 50th anniversary of the 1966 Historic Preservation Act in the United States. And there was a lot of navel gazing that went on in regard to that. Lots of writing and symposia and things that happened, thinking about, okay, well, what has happened in the last 50 years? Where have we come? How far have we come? And where are we going now? And I was kind of excited about this moment in time. The magic 50-year mark is always a thing for us. And I was interested to hear what people had to say. I went to a couple of these symposia, and read a lot of the articles and the book that was created and a bunch of things. And I just kept thinking, I'm not sure we're quite there yet. I don't know. I'm not sure we're thinking far enough ahead. I think we need to be pushing beyond the next 50 years and thinking about the next 250 years. And so then this happens all over the world. And then this happens. And everything changes. The whole conversation changes. We now have a completely different landscape that we're looking at. And not just here in the United States, but really all over the world. And so what does that mean for us as a discipline and as a profession and as practitioners? Well, I think one thing that's happening is that the pendulum is swinging. We started really as a grassroots movement. We professionalized. That's us. We are that generation of folks who professionalized this effort, taking it from all volunteer efforts with picket signs to really creating CRM firms and consultancies and going out and doing the work. It's not to say that that work doesn't happen still in the volunteer sphere, but it's really shifted. The momentum has shifted. And I would argue that it's shifting back, that the momentum is shifting back towards more community engagement, and with good reason. So, here's LBJ signing the 1966 Historic Preservation Act, and you cannot look at that picture and not think about what that means in terms of what was going on when we really formalized our conservation work here in the United States. There's one woman, and the rest are white men, and everyone is white. And you cannot think about that. I mean, you cannot ignore that fact of the beginnings of conservation in the US. It's definitely a part of it. And it's not to say that's the only story to tell, but it is a big one. And so the good news is that I think that that dynamic is changing. This is my graduating class from just a few weeks ago here. And you can see that there is diversity in this next generation. And this is just this year's picture. I could have put a whole montage up there, but I know that my students are diverse and they are very interested in the stories of them, of their own lives and their own communities, and sharing those tales and resources beyond just the sort of mainstream rich white male story that we have done an excellent job at documenting so far. We need to stretch a little beyond that, those boundaries. And these are not news flashes for you all know this. But I think it leads to some other issues, right? So here's the map of the NICP programs in the United States. And you can very clearly see that they are largely concentrated in the East, and certainly east of the Mississippi. And there's some room for improvement here. Although I do like, kind of dominating the West Coast. I do enjoy that aspect of things. But I also look at maps like this, which talk about, okay, where are the Latinx communities in the United States and how are we reaching them? Los Angeles is a majority Latinx city. That is the largest population in Los Angeles. So I'm, really thinking a lot about what are the issues going on in my community and how are we grappling with this in terms of conservation. So where do we see this population, and how does this map that I just was talking about reflect here? Where are we missing stories? Are we missing things because we don't have programs in the places where these folks are? And you could do this for any number of groups. I just happened to have this one handy. So the good news is that there's a lot of organizations that are kind of stepping up. Actually, this reflects something that Michael said in the chatter before we started about the fact that foundations and nonprofits are stepping in to fill gaps and to try to push the envelope. And organizations like Latinos in Heritage Conservation, HPPA HIP, which has been around for a long time, they're the OG of this group, and have done amazing things. And the Rainbow Heritage Network, LGBTQ plus issues, as well as many others. This was, again, just a little smattering of samples that I was thinking about. So we have a lot of folks who are now starting to push in different directions, which is great, and to advocate for heritage justice, because representation matters. Not being able to see yourself reflected in the historic record is an issue, and is an issue for all of us. And certainly you know, I'm pretty white, but boy, I'm a woman and I don't see myself reflected in the historic record at all. So there's a lot of room for opportunity here, and representation matters. So we need to do some important things. We need to launch all of these ships all at once. So mentorship, scholarship, internships, leadership. We need the next generation of folks to reflect our communities. We are too white as a field, and we need more people of all different stripes to be leading our field. We have some other issues to grapple with here. Things like, this is a slide that I borrowed from Adrian Scott Fine at the LA Conservancy. He was talking to one of my classes last week, and we were talking about Sister Mary Corrida's studio in Los Angeles, which was recently designated as a local landmark. You can see what it looked like between 1960 and 1968, which is the period of significance for her studio work. It's a modest building. And now what it looks like is a dry cleaner. Bless you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And it's, you know, it's changed completely. And if we looked at that now, we would say, absolutely not, that cannot, there is no integrity on that site. But it wasn't significant for its architecture. It was significant because it was the home of Sister Mary Corrida, who was a social justice activist and a graphic artist who taught people how to create picket signs and posters and things like that to advocate for all kinds of different causes. And this was where she did her work, was in this very modest building. So what do I do? We keep having these conversations with the conservation consultants in LA who say, okay, well, what do I tell my client when they want to make a change? And now it's a historic cultural monument. And what is it they're going to review? If they want to make changes to that site, how do they evaluate that? So sites of cultural significance, we still do not have a firm grip on how to handle this. And this is important and essential to us being able to move forward. So this is definitely the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, for sure. We have some tools that have been developed, but we don't really know about them or use them very often. Things like traditional cultural properties designations. So this is the Bohemian Beer Garden in New York, which was the first non-Indigenous site to use the TCP designation. And then Fishtown in Michigan, which is the most recent group to use this designation tool. It's really amazing and super interesting and a flexible way to do it, but we don't really talk about it very much in our toolbox. We haven't really embraced this as an option. But folks who have, and the folks who are really, kind of like this, the driving force behind this Fishtown nomination was actually a folklorist who has crossover in the conservation world. And we have so much to learn from the folklore community about tools that we don't normally use when we are thinking about sites of significance and designation. So I think that's an opportunity for growth. Obviously, climate change is happening. This is, everyone's talking about it, but it can't be stated enough that this is a game changer. And if we are thinking about a long horizon, this is, we cannot make any decisions about what we do in 50, 100, 250 years without taking into account what's going on with climate change. And things like extreme weather events and sea level rise and the wildfires that we're grappling with here in California with the extreme drought that's going on. There's so many things that are tied up with climate change. And apparently the dogs next door are, I apologize. So, Holland Island in the Chesapeake, this house is gone. This was from 2010. That island is gone. Tangiers Island in the Chesapeake. There's a lot of places where this is already happening and is visible. One of the interesting things that's happening now, is that really loud? No? Okay, all right.
It's actually fun to hear them.
Okay. One of the interesting things that's happening now is this, the rise or the sort of evolution of this climate heritage network, which is exciting. And I hope you all are following what they're doing and the ways in which they're connecting many organizations around the world in this effort to grapple with the issues of the relationship between climate change and heritage. And some really interesting work and interesting thinking coming out of that group. And I really encourage everybody to connect up with them. Another thing that we need to really start thinking about more clearly is intangible cultural heritage. And, we do an absolutely excellent job at saving the built environment. We know all kinds of things about all kinds of materials and about tools to document and tools to save things that are built. But a big part of the equation, an increasingly more important part of the equation, are the issues of intangible cultural heritage. And so I go to France in the summers, and I saw this article about how they have now protected the sounds and smells of France's rural heritage. And I thought that was amazing. And I wanted to know how that actually works. How do they do it? What tools do they have? It's a little murky what that actually might mean. And I did a whole session on this at the California Preservation Conference last year. And it was super interesting. It was about, sensory heritage, smells and sounds, and how does that play into the historic built environment? How do you conserve significant acoustics? And that, because that's a character defining feature of a place. And so what do we do about that? So intangible cultural heritage and things along these lines are also super important. Global heritage. This is the current map of UNESCO World Heritage Sites. All the little yellow ones are the cultural heritage sites. The green ones are the natural. And the red ones are the ones that are in danger. Well, what's very clear at looking at this map is that Europe is covered. Kind of literally, like you can't even see Europe on this map because there's so many dots. And so when we're thinking about heritage and sort of where we are getting so much of our policy, et cetera, this really emanates from Western Europe, and which has really dominated the conversation for a long time. I think we have an obligation to really stretch ourselves and embrace and explore the strategies of the global South of conservation. It's not all the same, no matter where you are in the world. Some of the tools that we can use here in the United States are absolutely not appropriate in other parts of the world. And this sort of global thinking, I think, really is important, and we need to be bringing some of these amazing strategies and lessons that are being used in other parts of the world that are not Western thinking into our own practice here in the United States. And so I think that's a challenge. I think Laura Jane Smith talks a lot about this in her 2006 book, Uses of Heritage, which if you haven't read, you should read. Because, she talks about the authorized heritage discourse, the idea that there is an orthodoxy of conservation, and that, the tools that we use and the sort of global World Heritage designation and all of the tools, the landmarking tools, and the sort of regulatory framework that we've created creates a conservation orthodoxy that sort of eliminates the role of the everyday person in this process, because we're all, as the experts in our field, as the experts who are trained as professionals, defining what is important, whose history is we curate through our work, and what stories are told. We are the authorized heritage discourse. So what does that obligation mean? And how do we, or should we step back from that? Well, one of these ideas, and this is not a new idea, this is from a publication by the Getty Conservation Institute from 2009 about community engagement in East Asia. And so this diagram talks about all the ways that we need to engage people in this process and step away from the experts a little bit, try to take a step back. And that's hard because we just went to grad school and spent a lot of money for this degree, which makes us experts, right? So, there's a conflict there. But then there's other interesting things happening here in the United States. Sarah Marstrom and her work with dismantle preservation. If you haven't seen the work that she's done or participated in any of her conferences or talks, I'm not sure that Sarah has all the answers. I don't think Sarah is sure that she has all the answers. But one of the things that she's doing is asking good questions about what we're doing, why we're doing it, and who it's for. And so I think, Sarah is sort of, and this organization, is really trying to sort of step back from the authorized heritage discourse and take it to the people, which, I think is a really good thing. It's also, she is very engaged in lifting up the next generation of leaders and folks who are going to be making these decisions and helping define these tools. Oops, wrong way, sorry. So I think in our field, words matter. And I think we need to really be pushing as a field to change the terminology in the United States. We are the only place in the world that uses historic preservation. And maybe it's a little bit of American exceptionalism in that regard. And I feel like we should be talking more broadly and thinking about conservation as a continuum between natural resources and heritage resources, and syncing ourselves up more closely with what has been happening in the environmental movement, and building on that strength of that collaboration between our fields. It's happening in the UNESCO world, it's happening in other places. We need to be doing that more clearly here in the United States. This is my unsolicited opinion on this. But I stand behind it because when I became director of the Heritage Conservation Program at USC, it was a historic preservation program. And one of the very first things I did was change the name, because 98% of what we do is rehabilitation, not preservation. Preservation has a very specific meaning. And So if those terms matter, we should be thinking about this too. We should be reading lots. Still, if you took supper club at Cornell, good. Everyone should take supper club. I shamelessly ripped that idea off, and it's a required course for my students. It's not even an option. Even if you are out of school and don't have to read books anymore, you should still keep reading books. There's a lot of really interesting scholarship coming out. And create a really dorky conservation book club for yourself. Maybe that's something that HPPA could do, and sort of, have it live on beyond your university. I think that's one thing that I hear often from my alums, that, you get busy with your life, you stop and you're doing your work, and you stop sort of thinking about what's happening next, how to sort of push yourself forward. So I want to encourage everybody to read books still, and to think outside the box. We did a studio with a nonprofit homelessness organization in Pasadena, and our students thinking about the ways in which heritage conservation and homelessness are related, intertwined, and how we might be able, as conservationists, to help address issues of housing the unhoused. How can we use our powers for good in this way, in this very fundamental way? And it was an amazing studio. It was amazing to work with this nonprofit organization and with their clients, and with the local Pasadena conservation community, about how these things are intertwined and how they might actually help one another. So we need to get out of our safe space and get uncomfortable, which I will tell you this very much was for me. And I think, along those lines, I think we need to use our networks. I think that I am in touch with many of my classmates from the class of 2000, and that they are an amazing resource for me as a professional. And I have worked on many of them in various ways on projects and looking for ideas, and they're all over the country. And that's just my class. And, HPPA, which, I joined as a life member long ago, because I know that the network of our alumni is important. And we are all connected through this common bond of Cornell and Sibley Hall and Sage Chapel and all of the things that we've all lived through, right? And so that means something. And it's the same thing I encourage with my students at USC, which is, this network is your professional network going forward. Cultivate it. The other thing I would say is that we need to be relevant as a field and as a discipline. If we are not addressing the issues of shelter, food, health, and quality of life, what are we doing? How will we survive if we are not doing these things? And so thinking about the ways in which our discipline intersects with these very foundational issues, how are we relevant to shelter? Well, that's an obvious one. That's the sort of low-hanging fruit in this particular list. But how do we relate to food and health and quality of life? How is it that we, as conservationists, tie into all of that? So I think we have a to-do list. We are an incredibly multidisciplinary field already. Most people don't know that or don't think that about us. We are futurists, which seems crazy to most people. we already have this inherent strength of all the different ways in which conservation is currently practiced, and all of the things that I was just talking about, that we need to stretch ourselves in different directions. We need to be talking about this and building on that strength. We need new alliances. If we are going to be relevant, we need to be connecting with people and issues that are working on the things that matter, that are relevant. Homelessness organizations, food security, water security, climate change, all of these things. This is where we need to be as a field doing this kind of work. This is not easy for us. I'm not saying it's like, oh, we're just going to go around the corner and hook up with our local whatever. This is going to take some hard work. We need to augment the power of our existing tools. We have some great stuff in our toolbox. We need a bigger toolbox to be able to put more stuff in it, because we don't really have good tools for cultural resource conservation. We don't, in the United States, have really any great tools that we've developed in our field for intangible cultural heritage. It's starting to happen. San Francisco is doing some really interesting work on cultural resource inventories in communities like the Leather District in San Francisco and other places where it's not the buildings that make this place a place. It is the people and the culture that's there. And so how do you understand that? How do you wrap your brain around what's there and what needs to be protected? And how in the world do you do that? It's not a building. We got to get beyond that. Oh, see, I skipped ahead. So we need new tools for cultural and intangible heritage. I guess what I meant by that previous one, though, is that we have some tools that we need to make stronger. Things like harnessing the power of, I think every student in every conservation program, no matter where in the United States, needs to have some basic GIS knowledge. It is absolutely, it's not okay for them not to have that at this point. I think, we have all of these amazing tools that we can use, and we need to make them even better. And I think we need to continue our efforts to strive towards global domination. I really firmly believe in that. I think we have a lot to offer as a discipline. We connect people with both the past and the future. That's a superpower. We need to leverage that superpower much more clearly and really stand up. We should also listen to podcasts. So this is a shameless commercial plug for my podcast that I do with my students called Save As. And we did it because I wanted to really give a voice to my students to share what they are thinking, what's happening in their research. It's taking the theses off the shelf and putting it out there in a way that people can listen and understand and maybe provoke some thought about. And so I encourage you to get your local favorite warm beverage and sit and listen to a few of these. We just finished season 2 yesterday. And so I think I'm just going to say that heritage conservation, to me, is about the future, perhaps even more so than the past. And as stewards, we curate our past to serve our collective futures. What will our actions of today mean in 250 years? Who will be the Ruskin and Viollet-le-Duc of our time. How will we make the decisions today and put in place some of the tools that will change how the world is perceived in the future? How do we curate our story as humans? It's a big job. We have a lot of work to do. Clearly, I need to stop talking so we can go do it. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. This was an excellent opening talk. Any questions, comments? So I have a quick question about the podcast. When you said that this is a way for you to, or for the students actually, to take the pieces out of the shelves. So is that like part of the program? You do it with all the students?
I don't do it with all the students. You know, it kind of depends on timing. Not everybody finishes at the same time, and you know, who's around, and it's really hard to do if someone's already in a completely different time zone. So we do it, but we do it after students are finished, and in some cases we do what Where Are They Now episodes, where we go back to some of our alums who are still super connected to the program and talk about what they did their thesis on, but really what they've done since, and how it connects. And in part, it's a way for them to sort of share the trajectory of their work and how they've moved forward. And they're really interesting. And so it's not everyone, but it's most folks. And you know, we're still working on it. We've only got 2 seasons so far.
I think it's great because many people listens to podcasts, and this is a great way to communicate.
Yeah, it really is. It's fun. I've learned a ton. Like, who knew about audio editing? Not me.
We have 2 questions. Joseph, you go first, and then Hashim.
Hi, excellent presentation.
Thanks.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Hello?
Yep. Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, excellent presentation. Okay, excellent presentation. I got a real kick out of the photo of President Johnson signing the NHPA. That same thing struck me as well. All a bunch of white men. Yeah. I was at the Arch in St. Louis a few months ago. There was a documentary that was done at the time of the Arch's completion, which would have been about the same time, the mid-1960s. And the first thing that hit me is none of these construction workers, because it's scenes of the Arch, various stages of construction, none of these construction workers are wearing any safety equipment, no hard hat, no safety belts, not even safety vests. But the other thing that hit me is, wait, they're all a bunch of white guys. And it just showed something I might have not paid attention to years ago, that how we are progressing as a society. And I thank you for sharing that photo, because you would not have a photo like that, I don't think, these days.
You know, I'd like to think that's true. However, I'm not so sure. You know, I think there's still room to grow here, for sure.
Oh, I agree with you, but I still think you have to look at where we are now compared to where we've come 50, 60 years ago.
Absolutely.
But yes.
The other thing I would say for sure is that there would be a lot more women in that photo, because let me tell you, in conservation, there are a lot of women in leadership roles, which is very different than many other fields. And so I think for sure that picture would have a majority of women, and they might all still be white, but there would be a majority of women.
I just began listening to the late Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's book, and she begins by mentioning the changes that she has seen in her lifetime, not only in law, but in society as a whole. So yes, thank you for sharing.
Absolutely.
Ashima.
Thank you, Meher. Hi, Trudi. That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts. Very, very thought-provoking, lots of things going on in my mind. One of the things, so I stepped away from academia 2 years ago, so I'm not as up to date on this, but I was curious, and this is kind of not to put you on the spot, this is kind of more general musings. You know, we were looking at the list of NICP institutions. I mean, how many of those are HBCUs or HSIs? I wasn't sure if there is even any data or any relevant information on that, or even if there are institutions that have preservation programs at HBCUs or HSIs. I'm not sure where to find that information.
Well, the NICP list is still online. It's not hard to find you can search that. And I don't believe, Michael, you can correct me, but I do not believe that there are any HBCUs or HSIs in there.
That's correct, although it hasn't been for lack of trying. Not only my own behalf, but others' behalf. And toward that end, some of you know that Julie Johnson serves as the internship coordinator for NICP. This afternoon, she asked me about the cost associated with the annual conference for the Latino conference. And that has been approved. She will attend that, as she has attended the previous conferences for HBCUs. There are several conferences for African Americans that she has attended in the past. These are gifted African Americans who are likely to succeed. And we've had conversations on more than one occasion with this group of students. The reality is that it becomes a little bit more complicated because those people have a whole lot of options, and a whole lot of options that in many cases bypass preservation in a deliberate sense, but will embrace it at some point. It's been very interesting to see how that happens. The other thing to keep in mind is HBCUs are no longer attracting African Americans as they once were. The population, for example, of Florida State, Florida State is an HBCU that is required to admit African Americans. They never finish. The people who do graduate are the Hispanics. That's the other secret that's taking place. The HBCUs are actually losing alumni base for African American characteristics, and Florida State is not the only one. I've watched this for decades, believe me, and put a whole lot of my own time and money into trying to change the equation. There's nothing new about it.
Yeah, and I think the pipeline is really the issue here.
Yeah.
And I think, HBCU is historically Black colleges and universities, right? That's what it stands for.
Yeah.
Yes, and HSIs are Hispanic serving institutions.
Right.
Yes.
And so, I think that's one of the things that, like, I've done some work with the folks particularly in Latinos in Heritage Conservation, because one of the founders of that organization is one of my alums. And so she and I have talked a lot about what does it mean for, what does allyship look like? And how do we create a pipeline for folks into the field who may not come from traditional paths, even through universities per se, but maybe through community colleges or through, two-year institutions or vocational schools or other paths forward, community organizations, et cetera. What are the ways that we can tap in to different non-traditional pathways to engage people in heritage conservation, because they're doing this work already. It's not like it's not happening in the Latinx community, because it certainly is. It's just not necessarily part of the AHD. It's not part of the authorized heritage discourse. The sort of trained, through the path of grad school group. Now that too is also changing. And certainly, again, my students are very diverse and come from all over the place and have, lots of different community connections. And I think, there's a lot of that in Texas, University of Austin, Texas program. And so there's lots of community building that's happening, but it's coming through Latinos in Heritage Conservation and not necessarily through, the sort of traditional pathways. So I guess that's how I would answer that.
Great, thank you. Mehar, I saw your comment about Texas Tech being an HSI. I did not know that. That is so fascinating.
Oh, well, there you go. Excellent.
Yes. Zoe, please.
Yeah, hi Trudi, this is great. I was really interested in your comment about how you changed the name of the program at USC to reflect sort of more specific use of the words to describe your program. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if you also saw that switch sort of as a way to position your program maybe more globally, just because I'm starting to think about the ways that the term heritage is used more often in programmatic language in Europe, for example. So maybe if you could speak more about that difference between the United States and Europe, if you have any comments about that.
Yeah, I think it's the United States and everybody. It's not just Europe. And so, I had some good ammunition when I made this case to make this change, because it's, it's hard. Historic preservation is so embedded in the Park Service and all of the documents and all the ways in which we do practice this in the United States, that when I went to our faculty and said, well, we want to change the name to Heritage Conservation, they all looked at me like I was a Martian or something. Like, what are you talking about? And so part of it was that, I had the Getty Conservation Institute in my city and they knew who they were and what they did. And therefore, look, here is a global, amazing institution that uses this same term. It's not just me making some crazy term up out of nothing. And for instance, the Los Angeles Conservancy. So this is a word that we use regularly in our field, just not in the sort of regulatory framework that we operate in. And so, but I also think that being globally relevant, I think the idea that we need to be relevant at all levels is important. And anyone at any university will tell you that students come from everywhere and not just from the United States. And so if you want to be globally relevant, then you should be using terms that reflect that. And so I think that was a big part of it. And I also think that heritage has a broader meaning than historic. And there's lots of scholarship about defining heritage, and you could read, Lowenthal, or actually Laura Jane Smith writes a lot about that, about the terminology and some ways that the term has been used in negative ways as well as positive ways. And so I think there's a lot to unpack there. But heritage conservation as a concept, to me, was the best way of describing what I felt we did as a discipline. And I just had to, convince everybody else that that was true, which thankfully I was able to do.
Thank you. Jack?
Hi, thanks. Jack Glassman, architecture, class of 80 and HPP 82. Trudi, I was just, maybe it's further to the terminology thing. I was just gobsmacked by your observation that this is our superpower of connecting past and present. I'm not even equipped to sort of make a comment on that, other than just to say it's something I'm going to really reflect on for a long time. Just this idea that the opportunities or the pathways, as you say, multidisciplinary, really, sort of pathways and opportunities, connections. So thanks.
Absolutely. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And I'm always delighted to see an architect in the room. When, the fact that you have both, again, you have like an extra special superpower because you are both a designer and a conservation professional. And that really is an amazing skill set to cultivate, and we need more. I think every architect should be required to take a conservation class.
Agreed.
And I think that every time I talk to architecture students who don't have any idea that there is an existing built environment already, and I just think, oh my God. Anyway, that's another soapbox I can stand on at some other point in time.
Thank you. Emily?
Thank you. Yeah, Trudi, thank you so much for such a wonderful keynote for this whole symposium. I'm wondering if, some of the things that you've talked about, you have been able to see develop as like classes in your program. So things about, the diversity of preservation or the growing diversity of preservation over time. I mean, in my mind, from what you spoke about today, there's certainly enough material there, for like a whole course. So I was wondering if you were involved with any of that in your program.
We don't have a specific class on that because it's sort of woven throughout. Certainly, my own version of Supper Club, where we do the readings and the books that I showed, it's very much a part of that conversation. But I really think it's kind of, at least in my program, it is really, it filters through every class that we do. And I kind of think it's our responsibility to make sure that's true, because our world is not all one way, and we need to reflect our students and our population. Los Angeles is one of the most diverse cities in the world. So I have the benefit of that being my backyard, and that's an incredible laboratory for us to use. So our program, our projects go out and really engage in that work, our community engagement work, our classes that have clients in the community. That's the kind of work that we're doing because that's where it's needed.
Thank you. Emily, you want to? Susanna? Please.
Thank you. Trudi, I'm sorry for the sneeze. I meant to hit mute and I hit, unmute right at the wrong time.
No worries.
I apologize. But I really enjoyed your talk. I feel like you brought up a lot of really provocative things that I'll, like Jack, I'll reflect on as time goes on, and a great way to open up the symposium. I have to say that I think that many of us as preservationists or heritage conservationists, whatever you want to call us, are dealing with this idea of cultural heritage, and how do we recognize it? How do we protect it? And I just wonder how, and I'm struggling with it a little bit. I see it. I'm from Philadelphia, and the city of Philadelphia is starting a survey project, and they want to look at cultural preservation, and I'm not sure that they really know what they're doing. And that's not so much a criticism as an observation. Sure. I think that we all have the sensitivity, but the challenge is, how do we do it? And I just wonder if you could share some thoughts on how you're approaching that, or maybe how you're exploring it with your students.
Yeah, I have to say that I point to San Francisco a lot because it's a small city, and they have a really progressive planning department and city government that supports conservation work at the municipal level in a way that we all should be so lucky in some ways. And so, they were one of the first municipalities to create a legacy business program, and to think about that, because that's a form of cultural conservation as well. Thinking about, we typically would say, well, conservation isn't about preserving use, it's about preserving the space, and if the business goes away, then we at least still have the building. And I think that's changing, and things like this legacy business program that San Francisco developed, San Antonio has now, there are other cities that have done it, and now Los Angeles is now developing, is a big step in that direction. But the other thing that San Francisco has done is this, what I was talking about earlier, which is this cultural survey mapping, cultural survey tool that they've developed, where it's, really, how we all had to make survey forms in one of whichever class that was, where we had to design our own survey form. That's what they're doing for cultural resources, and trying to figure out how to capture meaningful information, how to document, and how to understand it, and what does it mean once they know what's there, and how do they grapple with that. And so again, they're creating these cultural districts now that don't have really anything to do, or is the primary motivation is not the physical architectural space, but rather the cultural continuity of a particular part of the city. Like Japantown, there is a Native American community that's being documented right now. There's lots of different aspects of the LGBTQ community that now are sort of going through this process of this cultural survey process. So we talk a lot about San Francisco and the work that they're doing, because they are pushing hard against some of these boundaries that are out there, trying to figure out how we can do this, how to develop a tool to help us do the next step. But I'm totally interested in hearing about other options that are out there. If other people know of things, I really thought the Fishtown TCP nomination was really well done, and I was excited when that happened. And that was just in January of this year. So, and I think that the folklore path is something that I'm going to really start to go down, because I think it might be the way of the future.
If I could follow up on that, and this is, it comes out of my own struggle with trying to unravel this whole thing. I'm just curious how it's going to change. And I should say that I'm a class of '88, so I'm on the older side. So, but how will this change the profession, right? I mean, are preservationists, and I'm going to use preservationists because it's just easier, although I have no problem with the change in language. But so how will this then change what we do professionally and how we approach our work, right? Because we're not folklorists. We're not you know, we're not 100% architectural historians, right? Although we do architectural history. It's just interesting to me because I feel like we're looking to the, I feel like I want to understand more how this is going to spin our profession a little bit, because I do think it is going to change it. And then what happens to, like, are we should we be doing that? Are the tools that we've developed to acknowledge and memorialize and preserve, protect buildings, is that where we should be starting? Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? I don't know the answer to this, but I think it's a provocative question, right?
Absolutely.
And I just throw it out.
Kind of what I was trying to do. So I'm
yeah. Yeah.
I mean, I think yes is the answer. I think that we are multidisciplinary already. I think, as I said, you know, we really already know how to save buildings. We're good at it. And we can even be better than we are, but we are really good at it. But how do we, it's not just about the building, because the people matter too. And in some cases, the building isn't the whole story. And, you know, that issue of like Sister Carita's studio, you know, like, what do you do with that when you go to evaluate that as, you know, like in the consulting world, you know, it's one of those things that makes your brain want to explode.
Yeah.
And so I think we need, so yes, I think we need to, I mean, I'm all for stretching. I think we are already incredibly multidisciplinary. I think we can handle it. And I think if we are going to be globally relevant, then we need to have a bigger set of tools. It doesn't mean that all of us have to be experts in every single tool that's out there, because right now I can absolutely tell you that you should never have me do building material analysis for you. Don't let me do that.
Right.
But I can do all kinds of other things. And, you know, there are things that we all have strengths in, because there are so many different ways that this field works. So let's develop allies and partners with folks who do have those strengths, so that we can add this in to our tools and make our field more inclusive in that way, rather than sticking to our narrow lane of architecture. Because I think that does us a disservice and does the future a disservice if we only think about architecture.
Very good. Thank you very much, Trudi, and thank you everyone for the great conversation.
Thank you.
Another.
Thank you.
It's weird to do this on Zoom, but
weird
anyway.
Zoom clapping. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So now I would like to ask Michael to provide us with some updates about the HPP program at Cornell. I'm sure everyone is waiting to hear your updates, Michael.
No one wants a potty break? No, all right, that's fine. Whatever. You remember we were supposed to be done by one date. I just, you know, whatever. Update. Well, latest update. Jeff will return from Spain on the 20th of the month. He's gallivanting around looking at all sorts of mission churches, and he's never had the opportunity to do that. Going forward, he intends to be here just a little while. Until then, he leaves again because he has a leave due to him. Then, to make life more interesting, Jeff intends to go back to Rome because he loves gelati so much. That the reality is that he decided that he'd do another stint in the Rome Center. So the update for Choose It is probably the most animated in many respects, or with respect to you all know his love for culinary delights. Those of you who have worked with him. Going beyond that, we did add Sarah, who is registered but is not on this. Sarah Bronin has been appointed by the President's Advisory Council, pending the confirmation of the U.S. Senate. And she taught preservation law this past term, not only to the preservation students, but to lawyers in the law school. All this took place in the law school. And she's in her own way proving to be a remarkable force. This is, of course, coming on the heels of the retirement of Dick Booth, because what has happened is Dick's retirement gave the opportunity to search for somebody who could do not only preservation law, but land use law and other activities that are taking place in the Department of Environmental Concerns and Equity. For those of you who do not know Sarah's trajectory, you can look at what it is she did in dealing with zoning issues in Connecticut. The material is all a matter of public record. She's been a true advocate in many respects for those issues for about 15 years. For those of you who are not aware, CHUSIT had her as an undergraduate, and that's how we got to know her. The reality is the network of people has grown. So take some stock. Those of you don't see any of the advisory council staff on this call, but I know that Bill Marzella and others from the advisory council will get to know Sarah when she is finally confirmed. Other news, we have the reappointment of Nathaniel Guest. What we're thinking in many respects is Nathaniel will continue to do what he has done. The range of courses go well beyond law. If it's the case that Sarah does get appointed as is expected and goes to Washington, Nathaniel will fill in preservation law as well as land use law and so on and so forth. So having a couple of lawyers lying around is a good thing, even though, well, you got to have lawyers of the right kind, of course, to make a difference. But I'm delighted that he's likely to be a professor of practice on a more than 1 year shtick. We've increasingly used the professor of practice label to have multi-year contracts, 5 years with 5-year renewable, just so that you know that some of you are in that kind of academic mode. Some of you are not, so this is just to share with you. We still have the services of Caitlin and Kristen doing whatever Caitlin and Kristen have always done in perspectives and NBMC, so that we've got a full roster of faculty going forward. The only other change in the leave pattern is Tom Campanella, who's been doing urban history, is going to take the entire year off. Tom and his expertise in China have been very helpful. Bo, who is a second-year student, has him as a minor member, and Bo is going on to his next degree, his PhD at the University of Virginia in architectural history. So it's entirely appropriate to see all of that taking place. We have at least 8, likely 9 incoming students. The majority of them will, the bare majority, are from other parts of the world. The reality is we have Indonesian, Thai, Chinese, Indian. It's the usual panoply that we've had in the past. We, of course, have some Americans who are tuning in tonight, and you'll hear from in the near future. But that's all good news. They have already been introduced to one another and are beginning to communicate episodically as time goes on. Going forward beyond this particular conference, I want to have a discussion with the alumni about the APT conference in the fall, because that's a likely point at which the students will be assembled. The APT conference will be in Detroit and in person. I know already that because I am a committee chair and a member of the Board of Trustees, I will be involved in that arrangement. You may not have focused on the fact that one of the students I had in BMC back when the earth was flat is now the chair of APT. And she has been a remarkable force for change. And I'm working with her and a group of her engineering colleagues. This was a student who did BMC with me way back when the earth was flat. But this relates in a sense to what Trudi was talking about in a different way. APT, I just finished conversations with the Park Service, the National Center for Preservation Technology, and they're giving the organization, APT, money for a think tank conference to deal with climate change, in part because there has been a change of staff, as you may know. Marty Hilton, who was the director until recently of the University of Florida program, has stepped down from that and moved to the National Park Service to lead the climate change initiative. And as a result, there is going to be more examination of the standards and activities. For those of you who are not aware of it, there is in the next couple of days a Canadian conference dealing with climate change that is being hosted by Susan Ross, who's one of my APT colleagues. And the list is another 75 people parallel to this in a sense. These are APT members who are interested in climate change. And of course, this is Canadian, not simply American. To go further along lines that Trudi was suggesting, the Canadians are much more aware of intangible cultural heritage just by their very nature, because Parks Canada has to regularly deal with the Bureau of Indian and Northern Affairs. So the question of APT's role will come back and surface in architectural terms. And the little dirty secret that you probably haven't been able to understand, that I rejoined the board of the APT, which is now chiefly women, not men, chiefly engineers, not architects. It is a completely different organization, and culturally, it is acting completely different. Now, the reason this becomes important, again, related to what it is that Trudi has suggested, is that the change is taking place. The question is, how fast is it taking place, right? At what speed and with what direction? You know, to my mind, this is all music to my ears, of course, for any number of reasons, because as you can see by my background, I've spent so many years in foreign countries that do not subscribe to the ICOMOS standards. In fact, don't have any relationship to what is cultural heritage traditionally defined by Western Europeans. And that is, of course, relates to the comment that Ritika made in the chat about the nature of the terminology in explaining to, well, explaining the differences in the terminology in different parts of the world. Well, coming back then to the program, I would hope that we could get together in the conference at the APT in person. And you know, there's always the question of, well, how to bring the international folks into the mix. The discussion at the APT meeting is crucial because the Getty has just given APT money to explore going to Peru. This is a little dirty secret, right? Which is to say that the international component of APT is gearing up. And of course, I've been a part and parcel of that, not only in India, but in other parts of the world. So I think going forward, a lot of the things that Trudi has suggested are being worked on slowly but surely, but there's a whole lot more work to be done, right? So I'm delighted again. Thank you, Trudi, for the remarkable summary of challenges. I think a lot of the challenges are being met, but it's not generally known yet because so many things are in flux. Any questions? Does anybody have any questions? No questions. I've exhausted you. It's too late at night in the Eastern time zone.
Michael,
Yeah.
Joe Schuckman.
Yes, Joe.
Simple question. Where are you?
I am in Ithaca, believe it or not, in my office. Depends upon the conference or the connections I make. I change out all of my exotic backgrounds for the discussion at the time. In this case, it's a temple interior in Cambodia, which I had a hand in hiring the painters to do the touch-up with a bunch of monks. This was one of the temples in northeast Cambodia, which was the last to be basically brought into governance, legal governance for a number of years. In the end of the Vietnam War, it was basically Pol Pot. But I worked with the monks and the recreation of the murals, which are delightful. You can barely see, talk about intangible heritage. In the back there, behind me, is the laundry of the monks. That takes place there too. Good question. Thank you for that, Joe. We'll take you someday if you wish. We'll take you to Cambodia.
Just say the word. Now, how badly were the artwork damaged under the Pol Pot regime?
Yeah, it was abandoned for years. In other places in Cambodia, I've gotten into this because the Center for Khmer Studies, for example, was a very similar Buddhist Wat. And the natural figures in the wall paintings were used as target practice by the Pol Pot, just essentially to occupy time. And the real, the discussion that you have in these sorts of situations is whether, to what degree you restore, or whether in fact you are going to deal with the artistry in a different fashion. In many cases, I've had the discussion, and we keep the bullet holes in the walls and begin to stabilize the activities that are, because there is lead in the wall that essentially makes a difference in the manner in which you treat the wall. But there's a lot of discussion that takes place around these. These are both tangible and intangible because of the nature of the practices that are going on. And it's not just the laundry that takes place. I've had any number of insects, burnings, and discussions in this particular context. That's why I say, anytime you want to visit, I can introduce you to a whole bunch of monks in saffron robes. Good.
Great. Thank you very much, Michael.
You're welcome.
Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Trudi, again for the great lecture. So we're gonna continue the symposium tomorrow at noon Eastern time. I think the first presentation of tomorrow is from Zoe, I think. But you can check the program in the HPPA website. If you haven't checked it, please go there and see the kind of new HPPA website as well. Excellent, great. Thank you all very much, and have a great night or day, wherever you are.
Thank you so much.
See you all tomorrow.
Good night, everyone.